This week, we have learned how to use the guideline marker on our Destiny 2. Now to do that, we've used McCall's number 7568, which is my brand new dress pattern. Now, the photo on the pattern envelope has a beautiful, kind of springy lace design that could be used in bridal or special occasion, but we've changed that up a bit by using different fabrics. I want to take some time and share some sewing tips and tricks with you on how to assemble this dress, just to kind of show you how easy a design really can be. Now, we're going to begin with our fabric preparation. Anytime you create something, you want to break it down into different steps. And the first thing is to prep your fabric. Here, I've basically laid out my selected fabrics just to get an idea of how the design is going to be. I knew I wanted the navy fabric for the upper torso or the bodice, and my fabric inspiration had the skirt with different pieced bands of fabric. And so I've just laid this out on my cutting table to see if I like how my selections look. And I think they look great. The next step is to prepare our patterns. And so what I've done here is I've laid my pattern pieces out on the fabric, and I actually like to use pattern weights, and I have a hard copy of the original pattern, so my tissue pattern right here is actually heavier pattern paper. But if you simply cut your pattern pieces out, lay them on your fabric, the next thing you can do is trace them in chalk. I do this all the time, and you'll notice that it eliminates having to use pins, and I can easily just cut on the chalk mark on my fabric. So there I have saved a ton of time preparing my pattern pieces. And for me, cutting out my pattern pieces, if I had to pick something that was my least favorite thing to do, that would be the step. All right, the next thing I did was I cut the rectangles or the bands of fabric for the skirt. I've got the navy bands, which are going to be the upper portion, and then I've gone to the tweed fabric that has the stripes in it. And I've just laid this out on my table, and I'm just kind of evaluating where the stripes are so that when I cut my pattern piece, I can have some of the stripes falling in the correct location. The next thing that I did was I laid out my lining fabrics. For my design, I'm actually using quilting cottons from Riley Blake. And as referenced earlier, I almost never use slippery lining fabrics to line my garments because they're just not durable. And a lot of times I want more structure. So these quilting cottons, and you want really high-end quilting cottons, which are very affordable, and they make a really great lining. So we've got those in our garment, and I've cut my fabrics out as well. The other thing that we're gonna do to prep our sewing is we're going to prep our sewing machine. And here I've gone and I picked out different threads that are gonna match my project, and I've wound plenty of bobbins. There's nothing more frustrating than running out of a bobbin mid-project. So make sure that you wind several different colors and that you have those ready, so when you need more bobbin, you don't have to stop and wind. You can just continue your sewing. So the prep work is key, and it's one way that you can break down your sewing in stages. Say for example, you only have an hour time on a Friday evening. You can get all of your garment cut out and your machine ready, and then you can tackle your actual sewing the next time you have time to sit at your sewing machine. All right, we're ready to begin sewing. I like to break my garment into components, and our dress has two major areas. We have the skirt area, and then we have the upper area. I like to get the larger pieces out of the way, so we are going to begin with our skirt sewing. Now what I've done, since I already have my pieces cut out, is I have them laying on my cutting table, and I always like to continually reference my design and thought process. So this gives me the opportunity just to kind of see a good visual of how the bands of the fabric are going to lay out. And I've also placed some of my initial embroidery thread on there just to see how that matches. As I'm sewing the bands of the skirt together, I want to make sure that I press as I go. Now, in industrial sewing, they never press, but in custom sewing, and especially when you're doing beautiful designs like this, you always want to press as you go. Heat and pressure is key. If you have a heavy iron, that's going to be your best friend, especially with these wool fabrics. They're going to take to that moisture and that heat very, very well. The other thing when we're sewing, especially this design, is we want to make sure that we are matching our stripes and our lines, which you can easily see here. I've used the guideline marker to help reference as I've sewn these bands together. Now that we have the skirt bands sewn together, we're ready to gather the waistband. So what I've done here is I've taken the upper portion of the skirt and I'm running 2 rows of basting stitches around the upper area. Once this is done, the overall body of the skirt is put together and I'm going to set that aside. The next major component area is the bodice, and since I already have the pieces cut out, I always like to pin them to my dress form just to get an idea of how the design is going to look. And so that's what I've done here, and I'm ready to begin. Now I need to go and cut out the inner lining and the lining. And so what we've done here is I have the lining pieces of that Riley Blake cotton fabric cut out, and I'm laying them on top of that garment flannel. Now I mentioned earlier in the week when we were talking about sewing that I would tell you why I quilt my linings and why I use garment flannel. So I'm going to pause here for just a moment and explain that. Now, when you're lining a garment, the inside of the garment is always the foundation for how something looks on the outside. Now, you certainly don't have to do this on every type of garment, but this particular design, which has a stable fabric on the outside, needs a really good solid foundation. And it also helps just to keep the structure and the integrity of the garment together. And so that's one main reason why I love the garment flannel. It also adds some more body than just a single layer of like a polyester shiny lining, or in couture sewing, the silk organza is a very common finish for the inside of a garment. But silk organza is very, very weak when it comes to abrasion, and it's going to wear out and fray very fast. So quilting our lining adds a very durable inner layer, so the wear and tear of the garment happens on the inside rather than the outside. For example, if your body fluctuates just a little bit and the garment's a little bit snug, the stretching and the wear and tear will happen on the lining seams instead of the outer garment. And I do want to reference that the bottle of spray there is like embroidery spray adhesive that's temporary. I love this for attaching my lining pieces to the garment flannel because it temporarily holds them together, so I don't even need to pin. It makes that step very, very fast. All right, so what we've got here is some basic seam assembly of the lining of the bodice. Now we're going to go in and we're going to quilt the lining, and this does a couple things. It holds the garment flannel together, and if you're using really good quality garment flannel and quilting cottons, they're not going to shrink. Now I do always pre-wash my cottons, but rarely is there a huge amount of shrinkage in there. Just be mindful of that. But the quilting looks fun on the inside, so it's an aesthetic thing, but again, it also provides me an opportunity to have reference points on the lining. If I'm going to be sewing boning, for example, if I was doing this dress as a formal design, I would have channels of boning in there. And I can use that guideline marker to make perfectly straight boning channels, and we saw an example of that in our guideline marker demonstration. Okay, so all of our seams and we've quilted our lining. Now I'm going to stick that to my dress form just to get an idea of how it looks and how it fits. Looks just fine. The next thing I'm ready to do is actually sew the outer fashion fabric of the bodice. I put more of my structure on the lining so that the outer fashion fabric has minimal details sewn to it. Now I may do an additional inner lining on a bodice for a formal design, and I may have some boning sewn into the actual seams. But on this garment, it doesn't need to be heavily tailored, so all we need to do is sew the basic seams and press them open. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put right sides together, and we're going to sew across the top of the design. Now I've inserted a nice piping trim as my tiny strap for that. You can go strapless, you can add something wider or different fabric, whatever your selection. I'm going to turn the design inside out, and I'm going to make sure that the layers match up. And then I'm going to go to the iron, I'm going to press that really nicely, and make sure you do some understitching on that top neckline area. Now what we've done is we've already sewn our skirt and we've applied basting stitches. So we are going to pull up those basting stitches and we're going to divide that fullness into 4 and we're going to pin that to the bodice, right sides together. I'll run that through the machine and let's take a look. I always like to put it on the mannequin at this point because it's fun to see how the design looks together. The other thing I want to point out is when you attach a skirt or some sort of fullness or something to the bottom of a bodice or garment design, it's going to weight it down and kind of add stability to the seam line. So it looks, of course it's navy here, but that makes it nice and crisp. Okay, now we are going to assemble the lining. And so here we're just sewing vertical rows of rectangles in the lining. And then we are also going to put a basting stitch around the upper side of the lining. In this view here, we've attached the lining and I did the exact same thing. I pulled that fullness up, divided it into 4, and I've gone ahead and stitched that. And then now it's really important because we have 2 layers of fullness that we take this over to our iron and we're gonna press this really good. The wool fabric, the cotton lining, they're gonna press nicely and this is going to help relax the fibers and that excess fullness so that when we finish off the waist seam here, which what we'll do is we'll just add a nice bias binding. You can make your own out of the leftover cotton fabric or use some sort of twill tape or something, but that's going to help flatten that so it is flat against the body. All right, so remember our custom stippling stitch that we used previously in our lessons when we were learning about the guideline? Well, here is the application of the stippling stitch, and here is the back of our dress. And what I basically did was I stitched that down prior to inserting the zipper so that the zipper wasn't in the way of the machine creating that stippling stitch. And I used that guideline marker to make sure that it was nice and straight. All right, we're almost done. We're gonna cut out our shape for our bow, and then I always like to use colored netting that matches the outer fabric when I am stuffing, especially for a bow. If you use a darker color, sometimes that'll change the hue, and you might want that, but in this particular case, I just use yellow netting, and it's machine washable, so the care on that is appropriate. And then we're gonna use our button thread, and I'm going to sew the opening of the bow together. I just take a needle and thread, and then I hand stitch a heavy basting stitch up through the center of the bow. And then cinch that up, and then that will basically gather that center portion. And then I have just a little scrap piece of fabric that I will wrap around that and then tack in the back. Next, we're ready to attach this to the dress, and I love how this looks on this dress. The yellow contrast against the navy is just great fun, and of course, if you're not a bow person, you certainly can omit that, or you can scale it down and make it smaller if you'd like to, but it really stands out on this design and this fabric. And here in this black and white picture, it's just kind of an artsy illustration, but it's just very Dior, new look, 1950s, which I mentioned earlier in the week that is my favorite designer. Okay, we've got just a few things left to do. Right here, what I'm doing is I am attaching the lining to the bottom edge of the skirt. So what I did was I just hung the dress on my dress form and I pinned those layers together. Now I'm ready to attach my decorative hem binding. I use this really great white, it's actually a lingerie lace, but it's very soft, it's a little stretchy, and it's just very comfortable, so it's never gonna snag on any, like if you're wearing nylons or anything under there. So what I'm doing is I'm stitching that to the bottom edge. Now what I did was I turned that hem under, and to finish this off, I am hand sewing the lace to the cotton lining. So my stitches, and this is actually a very couture finish, and depending on your fabric, you might put some more stabilizer under your hem. There's lots of different application, but the whole point here is that you do not see the stitches on the outside of the garment, and I line almost everything, and I call this a version of a bagged lining. And let's take a look here. This is the dress hanging on a mannequin, and although in a photo you wouldn't see it, but you don't see any stitches showing through the outside of the garment. And that's definitely one way to make sure and ensure that you have a professional finish and not a home sewing look, because you certainly don't want your stitches showing on the outside. All right, well, we'll finish it up with a couple pictures of our final dress design. we're gonna go ahead and I had some extra fabric and I decided that I would make a little shrug to go on the back. And you can follow me on my blog, www.perfectfitblog.fashion, or you can certainly go to designerjoy.com and link over to the blog, and you can check out the instructions for sewing the shrug. The last piece of advice I'm going to leave you with is to always make a fit sample. Anytime you sew a fashion garment, make a fit sample out of a cotton, muslin, fabric, or something similar to your final design, and check all of the fit prior to sewing. If you do this, then you can go start to finish, just like we've done in this video here, and you can ensure that you're gonna have successful results. And for more on fitting and learning to fit, also check out my website, designerjoy.com.